The laughter reached her before the voice did. It came from the far end of the Ashbourne gallery, where a cluster of gentlemen had drawn together near the window embrasure, their backs to the gilded portrait of the 3rd Duke of Ashbourne, their attention fixed on the entrance through which Cecily Merton, Duchess of Renmore, had just limped into view. She heard it the way she had heard laughter for the past 2 years, as a thing with an edge, shaped to fit her specific silhouette, designed to carry. The man at the center of the cluster did not trouble himself to lower his voice. He was Lord Phintius Yardley, younger son of the Earl of Fenwick, a man whose beauty had insulated him from consequence for the whole of his 28 years, and he had a talent for cruelty that passed in certain drawing rooms for wit. "Poor limping Cecily," he said, with the satisfied precision of someone rehearsing a phrase he intended to use again. "Still dragging herself into rooms she has no business entering." The woman beside him, Miss Gwendolen Fawkes, pressed her fan to her lips. Her eyes moved to the Duchess and away again, quick as a caught breath. Cecily did not stop walking. She had learned not to stop. The ivory cane she carried was carved at the handle with a running greyhound, worn smooth at the curve where her palm closed around it each morning. And she had learned to trust it the way one learns to trust a quiet friend, without ceremony, without announcement. The left leg that had not healed cleanly from the carriage accident, 2 winters past, made its own particular rhythm on the gallery's parquet, and that rhythm was not invisible, and she had long since stopped wishing it were. She crossed the 20 feet of open floor between the entrance and the nearest arrangement of chairs with her spine straight, her black bombazine gown perfectly pressed, the morning half over by the calendar, though the room had apparently not received the news. At the far end of the gallery, near the tall windows that overlooked the Ashbourne garden, a man stood apart from the other guests. She did not look at him directly. She had been careful not to look at him directly since the first night of the season, 6 weeks past, when she had looked directly and found that he was already looking at her. He was Edward Hallowell, Duke of Ashbourne, and it was his house. The Whitmore presentation had been the occasion 3 weeks into the season when it first became apparent to the room that the Duke of Ashbourne was paying attention to the wrong woman. Lady Harriet Whitmore's coming-out ball had drawn 400 guests to a house whose plasterwork alone had cost more than most estates produced in a decade, and the Duchess had attended as the guest of her late husband's cousin, Mrs. Agnes Fenn, occupying the position she occupied at every such gathering, present, correct, invisible to anyone who had not already decided to see her. She was 32, widowed at 29 by a carriage that had overturned on the Bath Road in a November storm, left with a title that named a bankrupt estate, a leg that had knit badly beneath an indifferent country surgeon's care, and the season's settled consensus that she had nothing useful left to offer the marriage market, the peerage, or the general interest of polite society. Poor limping Cecily was not Lord Phineas's original coinage. It had been circulating since her first appearance after the mourning period, a phrase that traveled the way such phrases do, passed between drawing rooms like a card, with no return address, accepted without examination because it named what the room had already decided to believe. She had known Ashbourne by sight for 2 years, as one knows a landmark. He had been a figure at the edge of events, present at the significant gatherings, and visibly elsewhere at the significant conversations, conducting his obligations to the season with the focused efficiency of a man who would rather be reading dispatch reports from his northern estates. His face was constructed along severe lines, the jaw straight and the brow level, and the expression it wore most often was a particular variety of neutral attention that conveyed nothing about what lay beneath it. He had been a widower himself for 4 years, a fact the season discussed at length and with relentless speculation, though his dead wife's name was one he did not appear to speak aloud in company. He was 35 years old, the possessor of 42,000 acres in Yorkshire and Northumberland, and the only peer of the realm who had twice refused a royal appointment, on the grounds that the work was being done better without him. At the Whitmore ball, while Miss Gwendolen Fawkes had positioned herself 3 feet from him with the focused patience of a chess player executing an established gambit, the Duke of Ashbourne had turned his head and watched Cecily cross the room to take her place beside Agnes. He had not looked at Gwendolen. He had not looked at anyone else. The quality of his attention had been specific and utterly without performance, the way a man watches a candle flame in a room full of mirrors, registering the one light that does not multiply itself. She had felt it across 40 feet of candlelit space and had looked quickly away, certain she had mistaken the direction of his gaze. Her pulse had said otherwise. She had attended to her pulse with the calm skepticism of a woman who had long since learned that her pulse was not a reliable narrator, and had spent the next 2 hours attending very carefully to her conversation with Agnes and the small plate of food she had been handed by a footman and the precise arrangement of her skirts against the chair. And in doing none of these things particularly well, she had not mistaken it. If you have ever watched a room fail to see the woman it most needed to see, you understand what was being built in these weeks and what it cost her to keep standing inside it. The 3 weeks following the Whitmore ball provided the season with a puzzle it was not adequately equipped to solve. The Duke of Ashbourne appeared at gatherings he had not previously attended, gatherings which had in common no feature except the presence of the Duchess of Renmore. He did not, in any of these appearances, seek her out conspicuously. He did not cross rooms to address her, did not solicit dances, did not engineer proximity with any of the directness the marriage mart machinery would have recognized and responded to with its efficient, collective commentary. He issued her a series of short commands instead. "Come away from the window," he had said at the Pemberton Music Hall 2 weeks after the Whitmore ball, when she had stationed herself in a draught because every chair in the warm part of the room had been occupied and she would not ask anyone to move. He had said it without preamble, without softening, and had then turned and walked to a pair of empty chairs near the fireplace and occupied one of them and waited, as though the matter were already settled, as though her following him were simply what would happen next. She had followed because the draught had been making her leg ache, and because she could not, on reflection, identify a principled reason not to. He had not said anything else for 12 minutes. When Lady Pemberton's soprano had finally been given its ovation, he had said, "Your glass is empty. I'll have it refilled," and stood and done exactly that, and returned, and said nothing further for another 10 minutes. And she had sat beside him in the warm air near the fireplace, with the full glass in her hand, and understood that she was being looked after, and was furious at herself for finding it so difficult to object to. "The widow with nothing," Gwendolen had said, to no one in particular, but to an audience of 4, at the card party the following Thursday. The phrase landed in the pause between hands, precisely calculated. Agnes, across the table, had pressed her lips together. Cecily had studied the cards in her hand with exact attention, her face giving the room nothing to work with. The widow with nothing. It was a refinement of the usual formulation, specifically tailored. She had a title and an estate that ate money, and a leg that would not straighten fully, and a habit of saying what she thought in rooms that preferred women to say what would be easiest to hear. She did not have the social confidence of youth or the compensating fortune that might have purchased the season's tolerance for her inconvenient honesty. What she had was the greyhound-carved cane and Agnes's loyalty, and a small portrait of her father, a worn oval of ivory in a brass frame, that she kept in the inside pocket of her gown because she had carried it since she was 9 years old and saw no compelling reason to stop. She had held it in her hand under the card table during Gwendolyn's little speech and felt the frame's familiar edges, the slight dent at the lower left corner where she had dropped it on a stone floor in her 15th year, and said nothing, and played the next hand with the same calm that had carried her through 2 years of this particular species of arithmetic. It was on the afternoon of the Stanwix Gardner party, 4 days after the card party, that the witnessing happened. The Stanwix grounds ran to a topiary garden at the eastern edge of the property, separated from the main lawn by a yew hedge clipped into an arch, and it was through this arch that Cecily had slipped when the afternoon's conversation on the main lawn had grown too full of Gwendolyn's particular variety of smiling performance. The topiary garden was cool and dim, the yew walls high enough to hold shadow even on a clear June afternoon, and she had expected to find it empty. She found instead a child of perhaps 7 years seated on the low stone bench beside the central fountain, crying with the specific concentrated misery of a person who has been crying for some time and has given up expecting relief. He was crying quietly, which was the detail that made her stop, rather than simply pass through. The child was a boy with dark hair and a jaw that she recognized without being able immediately to account for the recognition. And she knew, without having been told directly, but with the certainty of a woman who had attended enough of the season's significant gatherings to have accumulated its secondary information that he was Thomas Hollowell, the Duke of Ashbourne's son, brought along from the country for reasons that were presumably the Duke's own. She sat down beside him. The stone was cold through the bombazine. "What has happened?" she said. Not a question. He looked up. His face was red from crying, and his cravat had come undone at one side, and he had that particular expression of suspended wariness that children adopt when adults appear unexpectedly in their private griefs. "I knocked over Lady Stanwix's vase," he said. "The blue one. From the mantelpiece. I was not supposed to be inside." "Was it the whole vase, or only a piece of it?" He blinked. "The whole. It went on the floor." "Then it is past mending, and worrying about it further will accomplish nothing useful," she said. "Was anyone hurt by the falling?" "No." "Then the damage is only to a thing, and things can be replaced." She settled the cane across her knees. "You will need to tell Lady Stanwick yourself when you go back. Not have someone tell her for you. That part is not negotiable." He looked at the fountain for a moment. The water made its small, uncomplicated sound against the stone basin. "Will she be very angry?" "She may be. You will survive her anger. It is not the worst thing that can happen to a person, being the object of someone's displeasure." She watched his face process this, the small furrow between his brows smoothing by degrees. "I have been the object of a great deal of displeasure in my life, and I find I am still here." Something shifted in his face. Not resolution exactly, but the preliminary to it. She did not hear the footstep on the gravel path behind her. She had no warning of any kind before she understood, from the particular quality of the silence that descended, that someone was standing in the arch of the yew hedge, and had been standing there long enough to have heard most of what she had just said. She turned. The Duke of Ashbourne stood with one hand on the stone pillar of the arch, and his face arranged in the neutral expression that had told her nothing. For 6 weeks, except that now, looking at it directly for the third time in her life, she understood that it was telling her a great deal. His gaze moved from Thomas to her, and held there with the same unperforming quality she had first noticed at the Whitmore ball. The quality of a man registering something he had not expected to find and was not certain what to do about. He had been looking for the boy, she supposed. He had come through the arch and found rather more than the boy. Thomas said, "Papa," and scrambled from the bench. "Go back to the house," the Duke said. His voice was level and quiet. "Find Lady Stanwick and tell her what occurred with the vase. Miss Hammond will go with you." A pause. "Thomas!" The boy looked back. "You will manage it." The boy went. The Duke did not move from the arch until Thomas's footsteps had faded on the gravel path, and then he came forward and stood on the far side of the fountain from her, his hand still, his face still, everything about him carrying the controlled quality of a man who had learned, very early, that the most dangerous thing he could do was let someone see that something had surprised him. "He has been grieving in the wrong direction," he said, not as an explanation but as a fact being placed where it could be examined. "His mother died when he was 4. He has been told that grief is private and that men do not permit themselves the luxury of it in public. He believes it." "You told him that," she said. A beat of silence. "I did." "You were wrong," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and the neutral expression shifted by the smallest possible degree. Not into warmth, but into something adjacent to recognition, the way a locked room's door shifts on its hinges when a key has found its match. "I know it," he said. He turned and went back through the arch, and she sat with the fountain's sound and the cold stone and the ivory cane across her knees, and tried to remember what she had thought she knew about Edward Hollowell before this afternoon, and found that most of it wanted revising. She had thought him cold. She had thought his attention to her a form of mild social curiosity, the idle noticing of a powerful man with nothing pressing to notice. She had thought the commands at the Pemberton Music Hall a reflex of habit, the way men of rank moved other people to positions of greater convenience, without considering whether the people wished to be moved. She understood now that she had been constructing a very careful case against what her pulse had been telling her since the Whitmore ball, and that the case had been, from its foundation, rather wishful in its architecture. The fountain ran on. A bee crossed the basin and vanished into the yew hedge. She sat where she was until she was certain her face would give nothing away, and then she rose and walked back through the arch and into the afternoon. The dark moment arrived on the 14th day of June. At the Dorvale Assembly Rooms, in the form of Lord Phineas Yardley, delivering a public proposal of marriage to Miss Gwendolen Fawkes. It was not the proposal that constituted the damage. It was the accompanying speech. Lord Phineas had a habit, when he wished to entertain a room, of arranging his observations as a series of comparisons, the second term of each being designed to make the first term appear more desirable. By contrast, he had deployed this technique for the benefit of 24 assembled guests in the Dorvale Assembly Room's main salon, and the contrast he had chosen, on this particular evening, was Cecily. He moved through his speech with the leisurely confidence of a man who has rehearsed it and found it satisfying, and the room, to its collective discredit, attended. A man of sense, he said, his hand at Gwendolen's and his voice carrying to every corner of the room, does not make his choice by sentiment alone, but by a careful reckoning of what a woman offers beyond the ornament she presents at a particular season's events. A beauty that endures, a family without embarrassment, a constitution equal to the demands a duke's household places upon its mistress. He paused. His gaze traveled the room and found Cecily at the edge of it, and settled there with deliberate precision. There are women in this room whose sole remaining distinction is a title attached to a ruin of an estate and a carriage-damaged leg that has made them an object of charity and something very close to pity for the past 2 years. A man who chooses wisely does not confuse the label with the substance. The widow with nothing. He said it with his eyes across the room, without using the phrase, which was worse. The room was very quiet. Gwendolen's fan moved in her hand, one quick betraying flutter. Agnes, beside Cecily, reached for her wrist. Cecily's fingers were already closed around the carved greyhound at the top of the cane, the smooth, worn ivory, the shape she had carried for 2 years and would carry. She understood in this moment with the clarity that certain small catastrophes produce, for as long as it was needed and not 1 day longer. She did not look at Gwendolen. She did not look at the ring of faces turning toward her to register how the blow had landed, which was the secondary pleasure such speeches were designed to offer their architect. She did not look for the Duke of Ashbourne. She knew, without looking, that he was in the room. She had been aware of exactly where he was since she arrived. The specific spatial awareness that his presence had produced in her for the past 6 weeks, without her permission. She did not look because she would not search a room for rescue, and because she would not let Lord Phineas Yardley see her searching. She said nothing. She inclined her head a fraction, as though acknowledging a remark addressed to her, and turned and walked with her even limping stride toward the side door that opened onto the Dorvale Assembly Room's anteroom, where there were chairs and no audience, and where she could sit down and let her leg rest, and allow herself the small private luxury of being angry. She did not cry. She sat in the anteroom with the greyhound cane across her knees and her father's worn portrait in her hand, the brass frame warm from her body's warmth, the painted face barely visible in the low candlelight of the unoccupied room. He had been a clergyman, her father, a man of no fortune and considerable goodness, dead 12 years, and she had carried his portrait because it had steadied her in every room she had entered since the accident, every room where she had felt the invisible accounting the season conducted, totaling what she owed against what she had, and finding her deficient. He had told her once, when she was old enough to understand what the accounting meant, and young enough to still believe there was an argument against it, that the world's verdict was not the final one. She had been 9 years old, and he had been alive, and she had believed him without difficulty. The anteroom of the Dorvale Assembly Rooms on the 14th of June was a harder place in which to manage the same belief, and she was managing it with limited success when the door opened. She did not look up immediately, expecting Agnes. It was not Agnes. The Duke of Ashbourne closed the door behind him and stood for a moment in the room's low light, and then came forward and took the chair across from her, and sat and said nothing for a long enough interval, that she finally raised her head and looked at him. His expression was the furthest thing from neutral she had seen it. There was something in it she could not name with precision, something that involved his jaw and the line of his mouth and the specific quality of stillness that occupied his hands, which were resting on his knees without moving, and which she understood, watching them, were resting there because he had placed them there deliberately, as a man places a thing down when he is not certain what he will do with it otherwise. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "She was quiet. She died in the 4th year of our marriage. The physicians called it a fever. I was in London for the first week of her illness, because I did not understand that it was serious, because the letter that came was written by her maid, and the maid did not wish to alarm me, and by the time I arrived, she was already gone. His voice was level and almost without inflection, the voice of a man reciting facts he has gone over so many times they have worn smooth. Thomas was 4 years old, and he asked me where she had gone, and I told him she had gone to God, which is the correct and the insufficient answer, and then I told him that men in our family did not weep for what could not be helped, which was the answer I had been given when my brother died, and which I have since understood was the worst possible thing I could have said to a child of 4, who had just lost the only parent he could reach. The candle on the small table between them moved in some private draught. I told him this spring that I had been wrong. I sat beside him and I said the words aloud. I am aware that one cannot simply revise the years. No, she said, one cannot. What you said to him in the garden was better than anything I have managed to say in 4 years. She looked at the portrait in her hand. He is a boy who wanted someone to sit beside him. He is. A silence different in texture from the ones that had preceded it. I have been trying to find the correct form of words for 6 weeks, he said, and have arrived at the conclusion that there is no correct form, and that the delay has been cowardice dressed in the clothes of caution. He looked at her directly, with the same unperforming quality he had brought to every moment of attention he had given her since February. I am not a man who offers compliments easily. I am asking you to consider something rather more than a compliment. Her pulse registered the sentence before her mind permitted her to understand it. Lord Phineas Yardley's opinion of you, he said, is not an opinion I share in any particular. I am aware that you are not Lord Phineas Yardley, she said. I am asking whether you would be willing to remain in this room long enough for me to be more specific. She set her father's portrait on the table beside the candle. The brass frame caught the light. She folded her hands in her lap, which was the closest thing to agreement that she was prepared to offer without knowing what she was agreeing to. And she said, I am not going anywhere. He was specific. She listened to him be specific in the anteroom of the Dorvale Assembly Rooms, with the muffled sound of the season's machinery conducting itself in the salon beyond the wall. She did not look away. Her hands did not shake. He spoke in the same level declarative manner he brought to everything, without ornament, without flourish, stating his intentions as a man states the terms of a considered decision, and she heard, beneath the level voice, the weight of something that had been held for 6 weeks without outlet, the particular restraint of a man who does not speak until he is certain, and is now certain. When he had finished, she sat for a long moment in the low candlelight before she said anything at all. You should know, she said, that the leg will not improve further. The surgeon was clear about that. I am not asking about the leg. I am telling you about it because I will not have it be a thing that is not said. Then it is said, he said, with the same level precision he brought to everything, and we may proceed. There was a pause in which the word proceed sat between them like a sealed commission, requiring only the counter-signature. Yes, she said. He was already on his feet when they returned to the salon, not from impatience, she understood, but because he was a man who, once he had arrived at a determination, did not linger in the vestibule of it. She followed him through the side door, and the room's conversation did not stop precisely. It reorganized, the way a flock of birds reorganizes around a suddenly altered wind. Lord Phineas Yardley stood where she had left him, still receiving the congratulations appropriate to a newly announced engagement, Gwendolen at his side with her hand on his arm and her fan at her lips. The salon's company numbered perhaps 30 persons. The Countess of Stanwick was there, and Mrs. Agnes Fenn, and 3 other women whose names and faces the season's verdict on Cecily had fixed, over 2 years, into a single expression of collective, calibrated dismissal. At the far end of the room, near the doors that opened onto the assembly room's upper corridor, she had not noticed until this moment that 2 additional figures had arrived in her absence. One was a man in the dress uniform of the royal household. The other, leaning on a cane that was considerably finer than her own carved greyhound, was a stout, older gentleman who had the air of a person accustomed to being recognized before he could introduce himself. Gwendolen saw the Duke first. Then Gwendolen saw the gentleman with the fine cane, and the recognition moved across her face in a sequence. Cecily watched with something that was not satisfaction, but was its near neighbor. Lord Phineas turned. The stout gentleman with the fine cane had already begun his progress across the room, and his progress had the quality of water finding its level, steady and inevitable, and the room parted around it with the instinctive responsiveness of people who understood. Suddenly, and without requiring anyone to tell them who was among them, he stopped in front of Cecily. His name she had known for 32 years. The room's 30 guests knew it. The uniform of the man beside him named it, if anyone had required the naming. "Your Grace," the king said, and bowed his head. The room held its breath. Cecily dipped into her curtsy, smooth and low, the left leg steady beneath her because it had learned to be steady, and when she rose the king was already speaking. Not in the formal mode of ceremony, but in the shorter, warmer register of a man who wished to be briefly direct. "I have been told," he said, "that you have been attending these gatherings with my old friend Ashbourne, and that you and he have developed an understanding. I wish to pay my respects to the woman he has chosen, and to add my own." He knew Ashbourne then. The room absorbed this with the collective speed of people recalibrating. 2 years of settled consensus rearranging itself in the space of a single bowed head. Lord Phineas was very still. "Your Majesty does us too much honor," Cecily said. "Not at all," the king said pleasantly. He looked at Ashbourne, then back at her. "He is a difficult man to impress," he said, with a slight emphasis on the final word that mapped the room's entire verdict and its reversal onto 4 syllables. "Do not let him tell you otherwise." He moved on. The uniformed man fell into step behind him. The room exhaled. The Duke came to stand beside Cecily, and the proximity was not the careful proximate distance of the past 6 weeks, but the straightforward proximity of something decided. And the room understood the distinction without being told to. 30 pairs of eyes had taken in the scene, and were now conducting the rapid recalculation that 30 pairs of eyes will conduct when a king bows his head at a woman a room has spent 2 years deciding to overlook. Lord Phineas Yardley opened his mouth. The Duke of Ashbourne turned his head. Not quickly, not with any heat, but with the level specific attention he brought to everything, and he said, in a voice precisely sufficient for the people nearest them to hear, "She is to be my wife." 7 words, delivered once, irrevocable. Lord Phineas closed his mouth. Gwendolyn's fan ceased its motion. The Countess of Stanwix made a small sound that was not a word, exactly, but was the sound of a woman reconsidering a number of things at once. Agnes Fenn, across the room, pressed her fingertips together and said nothing, and looked at Cecily with an expression that required no translation. The season's collective intelligence, which had been running at a settled consensus for 2 years, revised itself in the space of 20 seconds. The poor limping Cecily, who had been a fixed point of pity and dismissal, and the widow with nothing found in those 20 seconds, that the room's confident social arithmetic had arrived at a different answer. She did not look triumphant. She was not built for triumph, had no talent for it, and no interest in acquiring one. She stood beside the Duke of Ashbourne in the Dorvale assembly rooms with her spine straight, and her carved cane in her hand, and let the room revise what it wished to revise, without assisting or obstructing the process. Lord Phineas caught her eye once, briefly, and looked away first. She had not needed him to look away first. It was simply what happened. Lord Phineas made his departure within the quarter hour. He had the instincts, at least, to understand when an evening was finished. The drive back from Dorvale to Agnes's house in Becker Street took 40 minutes in the carriage, with Agnes's commentary providing an energetic account of every face she had observed during the foregoing scene, and a precise inventory of which expressions had been most satisfying. Cecily listened, and her hands were in her lap, and the carved greyhound was cool beneath her fingers, and outside the carriage window the June night was clear and mild, the last of the season's light holding blue and pale above the city's rooftops. She let Agnes talk. Agnes had been beside her for 2 years and had earned the pleasure of the inventory. She thought about Thomas Hollowell sitting on the cold stone bench with his cravat undone, and his face red with crying he had been told was not permitted, and about a man who had understood he had been wrong and was trying, however late, to undo it. She thought about the anteroom and the candle and the brass-framed portrait of her father, which she had left on the table when she stood to follow the Duke back into the salon, and which she hoped she had not lost in the evening's larger transactions. She need not have worried. 3 weeks later, when the banns had been read and the legal arrangements finalized and the small informal gathering at Ashbourne House had served in place of the formal announcement that both of them preferred to avoid, she found the portrait on the writing table in her new sitting room. Someone had polished the brass frame. It caught the light from the east window. where the summer morning came in clear and low across the garden. And she stood for a moment, with the portrait in her hand, and looked at the painted face, and thought of what her father had told her, 12 years dead and more than adequate to the moment. The world's verdict was not the final one. Thomas appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, 8 years old and recently relocated from the Yorkshire house, wearing the expression of a person who has a question that requires careful negotiation. "I thought you might want to know," he said, "that there is a greyhound in the garden." She looked up. "One of the estate dogs?" "I do not think so. He is very thin and his ear is torn on the left side." A pause. "Papa says if he is a stray we should feed him and then decide." "Your father is correct," she said, and set the portrait back against the window where the morning light could find it. Thomas disappeared from the doorway. She heard his feet on the stairs, 2 at a time, not worrying about the sound. In the garden below the east window, she caught the flash of a pale shape moving through the roses, thin and quick, and finding its own way toward wherever it had decided it was going. She watched it for a moment, the morning warm on her face, the ivory cane leaning against the writing table at her right hand, where she had set it when she sat down, close enough to reach in a single motion, which was all it had ever needed to be. She picked up her pen and began to write. "If this story has found you at the end of a long day, I am glad it reached you. There is more waiting whenever you are ready." The greyhound, it was later determined, had been astray for most of the summer. He remained at Ashbourne House for 14 years. Thomas named him Verdict, for reasons that the household understood without requiring explanation, and each morning for 14 years the worn ivory cane stood against the writing table, and the brass portrait caught the light from the east window. And the man who had once been very wrong about grief had learned, by degrees and with considerable effort, and the assistance of a woman who did not soften what needed to be said, to be less wrong about it, which is the most that can generally be asked of anyone, and which turned out to be, in the daily domestic warmth of that particular house, more than enough.